This morning's story is a familiar one. It's the story of Peter walking on the water of the lake. And it's such a familiar story. We know it's such a familiar story that my 5-year-old tells it to me every time she takes a bath. She says, "I wish I could walk on water like Jesus." Every time. It's such a familiar story. And yet, it's not so familiar. See, the part of the story that we know is the part where Peter is in the boat and he sees Jesus across the way and he says, "Jesus, I want to walk on water like you do." And Jesus says, "Get out of the boat." And Peter gets out of the boat and he takes a step, and then he takes another step, and then he takes a third step, and then plop, he sinks. And Jesus says, "Oh, ye of little faith." And that's the part of the story we remember where Peter sinks. And Jesus looks at him amused and says, you could have made it if only you trusted. But that's not the whole story. You see, the story begins with Jesus putting the disciples on the boat in the first place. He'd been spending a lot of time preaching on the countrysides, on the mountains, and in the valleys, and all around Galilee. And the story just before this morning's story is the feeding of the 5,000. You see, Jesus had fed 5,000. He provided this meal for all of these hungry people, and he was tired. He was drained. He used all of his energy, all of his emotions to do this miracle, this feeding of the 5,000. And he tells his disciples to get on the boat and go across to the other side of the lake so that they can have a little peace and quiet, a little time to reflect, to get away from the crowds. They are isolating themselves in this boat. And Jesus leaves them on the boat and goes up on the mountainside to pray. And he says, "I need a few minutes by myself," which is fair. And he goes up on the mountainside to pray. And meanwhile, the disciples are left in the boat. And they start to get afraid, and they start to get worried, and they think Jesus has abandoned them to this boat. And it's nighttime, and they can't see very well, and they are convinced that Jesus has left them behind, just like Jesus left the crowds behind, and that they are alone. And then they see across the distance a man standing on the shore. Now remember, they dropped Jesus off on the shore mere hours before. But when they see him this time, they've forgotten already to see Jesus there. They'd forgotten already that they were going to meet Jesus on the shoreline. That was the deal they'd made. But in just a few hours, they'd gotten afraid and they'd forgotten that that's where Jesus was going to be. And so they see this man across the lake and they get scared, and there's a big debate. Who is it? Is it Jesus? Is it an angel? Is it a ghost? Who is it? And Jesus calls out and he says, "Peter." And he goes out to greet him, and he takes a few steps into the lake. And Peter, as Peter does, gets excited and he jumps out of the boat. Well, he takes a step out of the boat and he says, "I want to walk too. I want to be like Jesus. Let me be like Jesus." And he takes a step, and then another step, and then a third step. And then that's when he gets afraid. It's the first 3 steps, he'd forgotten to be scared. He was so focused on the goal, the end of getting to Jesus, that he'd forgotten to be scared. But he gets out into the lake and he realizes that he is in unfamiliar territory. He looks around and none of the markers that he sees are the same. I mean, they're the same, but they're different. He'd been on this lake before. He'd been in a boat 1 billion times. He was a fisherman. But he takes 2 or 3 steps out of the boat, and that's when he gets afraid. And he forgets that he made it this far. Why couldn't he make it farther? It's the 3rd step, the 4th step, where he sinks. It's an interesting timing. See, he didn't get scared of getting out of the boat. It wasn't the getting out of the boat. It wasn't the event, the decision to leave the boat and go to Jesus that was scary. It was when he'd already taken a few steps that he got scared. One of my favorite things that our denomination does, the Presbyterians, the PCUSA does, is a group called Presbyterian Disaster Assistance. It's a group of our denomination. We take up an offering for them every year, a special offering at Christmas to help fund them. And what they do is they go in immediately after a disaster happens and do ministry. Now, they go to all kinds of disasters. They do, natural disasters like tornadoes and hurricanes, and they do man-made disasters like shootings and violent acts. They do all kinds of things. They are there on the ground. We are almost always, PDA is almost always the first group on the ground after a disaster happens. And they have all kinds of forms of ministry there. They help with, the physical needs at that time, providing food and blankets to the people who are displaced, or counseling services to the immediately grieving. They do all kinds of wonderful ministry, and they stay around. So they go in immediately in the aftermath of a disaster, and then they stay. PDA is still active in New Orleans doing Hurricane Katrina cleanup. It's one of our best gifts to the world. And a few weeks ago, PDA had some experts on trauma talking about what do we experience during times of trauma? Where do we experience during times of disaster? And the expert who was on there, and I can't remember his name right now, said, he said this. He said, immediately when they get to the ground, immediately when they get to the site of the disaster, they see people who are in shock and in disbelief, and they don't really know what their new experience will be, but that they have this steely reserve for about 2 weeks. It's predictable. They said it happened when they went to the Boston Marathon bombing. It happened after Katrina. It happened, this gentleman had been in Aurora after the Aurora, Colorado shooting. And he said it happens, you see the signs, the Boston strong, the Aurora strong, and it's predictable every time. About 2 weeks, the community makes it, and they band together, and they get stronger, and they have one mind and one voice. And then, predictably, 2 weeks, they start to fall apart. They get afraid and anxious and scared and grieving. It's predictable like clockwork. You see, they make it the first 2 steps, the first 2 or 3 steps. And it's when they start to look around and realize that everything is unfamiliar. It's that 4th step where things fall apart. We are, all of us right now, experiencing a mass trauma event. It doesn't feel like it necessarily because it doesn't have that marker, the thing at the very beginning that often sets off those mass traumas. We don't have a big hurricane or a tornado or a shooting or a bombing or anything like that. It doesn't feel like a mass trauma event in the same way, but it is. It is. We are, all of us, going through an experience of mass trauma where our lives are changed. They're different. It's a slow motion trauma. And we are, all of us, on that same time schedule. We see we've made it 2 or 3 weeks. We bonded together, we pulled together and did what needed to be done. And now we're looking around us in our experiences, in our environment, and our view of our world has changed. We realize that we are not where we're used to being. We realize that what we are used to doing, our schedule, our decisions making, all of that is different. And all of us are looking around and realizing that we've left the boat behind. We looked around, and this week, maybe it was last week, but maybe it was probably this week, we look down and we see that we're standing in the middle of the water, that the boat has been left behind, that our future, the next step, is uncertain. And we are, all of us, wondering, are we about to sink? You see, we've forgotten that Jesus is exactly where we expected Jesus to be. Jesus is already out of the boat. Jesus left us behind a long time ago. Jesus got out of the boat and went on the mountain to pray. And all of us stayed in the boat because it was safer in the boat. We knew what it was like. We knew how to do the fishing in the boat. And now we're being forced out of the boat. We're being forced to take a step out into the water, into the uncertain, into the uncharted territory. And we've forgotten that Jesus is already there in the water. You see, we're not going to a place that's uncertain. We're going to a place that Jesus has already been. And we're just having to catch up. And so when we look around and we see a world that's different, we have some choices to make. Are we still hanging onto the boat? Do we have one hand still grasping onto the side of the boat and waiting till that moment we can climb back in, waiting for the moment when we can be safe again, when the water is calm enough for us to swim back to the boat and to climb back into that safe place that we've always known? Or are we going to go where Jesus is? Are we going to reach out our hands and meet Jesus where he is in the middle of the water, in the middle of that uncertainty, in the middle of the waves? Or are we going to sink? Those are really our only choices. It feels like we have all these possibilities in our lives, right? We have all these possibilities of these places that we can be, these places that we can go. We don't know what the right direction is, we think, because we look out in the lake and we see water all around us. But in reality, we only have three directions. We can go forward towards Jesus, we can go backwards into the boat, or we can sink right where we are. Peter stepped out into the water, into the unknown, to go after Jesus. And he forgot that Jesus won't let him sink. That all he has to do is reach out the hand and go towards Jesus. Is that an act of courage? Absolutely. Is it an act of bravery? Absolutely. Is it scarier to walk towards Jesus? To walk on the water towards Jesus? Absolutely. But that is the right place to be. That is the place the wind is pushing us. And so, are we going to live into our fear and our anxiety? And are we going to let that be the direction that pulls us downward into the water? Or are we going to strap on our brave boots and walk on the water towards Jesus? Peter sunk. What will we do?